Today, we are talking about achieving maximum yield in your garden. My name is Kevin Espiritu from Epic Gardening. I'm here with my... Spring is coming soon, very soon, which means that myself, Jacques, and all of you watching at Great Grow Along are gonna be getting out in the garden, which means we're gonna need to stay hydrated, which brings us to today's sponsor, Element. Well, what is Element? It is a zero sugar electrolyte drink mix, perfect for gardeners and anyone who enjoys the outdoors. I have been using it for about 6 or 7 months now. I love all of the flavors, but I love watermelon salt, citrus salt, or raspberry salt. Absolutely delicious, and they provide a meaningful dose of electrolytes free of sugar, artificial colors, or any other dodgy ingredients, which is super important, especially if you're a gardener trying to grow your own food and know what's going into your body. Element is perfect for gardeners like us, specifically formulated for anyone on a mission to restore health through hydration. So 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium gets you the electrolytes that you need. And for you Great Grow Along attendees, you can get a free Element sample pack with your first order at drinkelement.com/GGA, which is drinklmnt.com/GGA. And of course, if you don't like it, you can return it for a full refund, no questions asked. My boy,
Jacques, the garden hermit at Jacques in the Garden.
and also a critical member of the Epic Gardening team, one who we bounce back and forth on how to get better yields from the garden. So today, specifically, we're going to talk about things you can do in your edible vegetable garden to maximize your yields. This is super important, even if you have, these days I have quite a bit of space here in my backyard, about 1/3 of an acre to grow on. Doesn't matter. I still want maximum yield out of what I'm producing. And if you're in a small space, raised beds, little in-ground bed, don't have a lot of area, of course you want maximum yield.
Yeah.
If you got 1 potato to plant, you better get 10 pounds of potatoes so you can get out of it. So speaking of, why don't we kick it off there? Do you have a tip on potatoes?
I will say that my tip for potatoes is a bit of a cop-out.
Okay.
Because what I found is that if I plant potatoes in a grow bag, I get like an okay harvest. You know, it's exciting still. It's always fun to dump that bag, dig for those potatoes and eat them up. But I found that putting them in a raised bed has literally just doubled my yield. I don't know if it's just having more soil that I think I give my plants.
Yeah.
And that's actually part of it is you're really controlling your yield based on how much you're giving it. So if I put a potato in a 5-gallon bucket and I put another one in a 15-gallon bucket, I guarantee you the 15-gallon bucket will give you more potatoes.
Yeah. So, I would say almost all cases that's going to be true.
Yeah.
We've done a lot of potato growing experiments. I've talked with potato growers around the world. And for the most part, that's right.
Yeah, there's a limit, I'm sure.
There's definitely a limit. There's like a genetic limit on how much a potato can actually produce, of course. But what I will say is what you probably experience with the grow bag is you lose moisture out the grow bag.
Yeah, I think it's mostly user error.
Some crops just struggle a little bit more with that. Potatoes, of course, I mean, what are they made out of, right? It's mostly water that's giving them that mass, right? And so what I've noticed with potatoes is planting varieties that really work well for you is actually it's probably most of it. And so for me, for example, I've probably grown about 15 types of potatoes in my life, and I've grown one called Russian banana. And you've seen us, you see, he knows. And it just doesn't yield very well.
It might be in the name. We're a little far from Russia here. So I don't know if we're hitting the same climate.
That's true. I think I've been cursed by the Russians. They don't want me to grow it. But regardless, first of all, it's a smaller potato in the first place, but it also just doesn't perform as well. Contrast that to a Norland or a dark red Norland variety. Here in my climate, that potato just cranks.
Crazy amounts.
Crazy amounts, and also unimproved soil, minimal care, minimal watering. One thing I'll mention is I think you can still get a great yield on potatoes out of buckets.
Yeah.
You just need to make sure you got some drainage holes in there, you're keeping it watered, and you're hilling it up. You can get a crazy potato yield out of buckets. I'm talking 10 buckets, you might get 100+ pounds of potatoes, if not more.
I've seen some really good yields. I think we're gonna get into some like really obvious solutions for maximizing yield, but I think this starting point is really great because those little things make a really big difference. And for me, that little thing was something that was easier to forget about and manage, was putting them into a bigger sort of container by using a raised bed.
Yeah.
But the other thing that we actually touched on lightly with the Russian banana is that variety really does matter.
Oh, yes.
Here in San Diego, a lot of people like, for instance, right now, it's a nice day, but it doesn't get crazy hot. So for example, if I try to put an Alabama okra out in my garden, I might get like 2 pods. So I need to make sure I'm choosing a variety that can handle colder weather because we're just not in that hot, humid south where okra really wants to thrive. So take whatever it is you're growing, try different varieties. Don't just go with whatever you think is best. Try something that maybe doesn't make sense, because sometimes those are often the ones that surprise me. Russian banana could have done really well here. It's not to say that we could predict that it won't, but a lot of it does have to do with variety and the climate that you are growing in. That is a big first step.
Yeah, oh no, it totally is. And I think I discounted this, especially early on when I was gardening.
Yeah, it's easy to discount.
I was like, which variety looks cool? Right? Which variety has a cool name? This and that. And you know what? Grow whatever you want. It's fun to do that. No, there's nothing wrong with that. But I will say, like, even the broccoli crops this year, I've grown probably 6 types of broccoli over the course of my gardening history. And the one that is in the background right now is far and away the best one. I'm talking head size, double anything I've ever grown, and still quite nice on the flavor. And so yeah, I would, if you want varieties that perform for you, just go to your local garden center and ask around, say, hey, you know, what are people buying a lot? What works really well? At a garden center, of course, you're gonna have someone who gardens there, and they're gonna be like, you know what, you got to do this tomato. You got to do this tomato. You can't be doing this one because it's, and it gets even down to where you live, even in your own city. Yeah, so for example,
totally true.
Right, we're here in San Diego. I'm in an area it's not very far inland. It's maybe 2-3 miles inland, but it's not super hot. It doesn't
2 miles in, entirely different situation.
You'd get probably another 5 degrees of heat in the summer, just 2 miles to the east. But if I go coastal 2 miles to the west, and I was to say be in like La Jolla, California or something, if I could afford a home there, I can't. I would have a really hard time growing peppers. I'd have a really hard time growing tomatoes.
I get okra.
I'd get powdery mildew all over the place because of that marine layer, right? And so you got to think about this. And I know this sounds like a far cry from maximizing yield, but this is where it all begins.
Yeah.
I was going to say, it's this, and then where I think you were going, which would be fertilizing, pot size. It's like, what are you giving that plant? It can't do anything if you don't give something to it.
Absolutely. And I wanted to touch on one final thing here with timing, because for example, that broccoli, if we planted that in spring, it would have maybe gotten this big, and then it would have got hot, it would have bolted, and you never would have got to the size potential. So we've learned in our area, for example, that we have to plant our brassicas, our cauliflower, broccoli, cabbages, Brussels sprouts in the fall so they could grow through the winter into spring, or else we're really not going to get anything at all, no matter what we do to it.
Yeah, and that took a while to learn. It took like, maybe I'll try it in the fall. Oh, maybe I'll try it a little bit in the fall. Oh, maybe I actually have to grow it in the actual winter, and that's what unlocked it for us. You know, you're bound to run into aches and pains in the garden, which is why I want to introduce you to our pain cream partner here at Epic Gardening, Nature's Willow. If you've seen Jacques, myself, or Epic Gardening at a gardening convention recently, we probably gave you a free sample, so let me tell you about it. So the secret ingredient of Nature's Willow is actually a natural ingredient. It is willow bark, or an extract of willow bark, so it doesn't use anything artificial. The compound in willow bark, called salicin, is actually the natural precursor to what we know of as aspirin, and when you partner that with the other ingredient, helichrysum's anti-inflammatory properties, you have a powerful 1-2 punch for pain relief. And it's perfect for gardeners because, first of all, it smells nice, it goes on easy, it's gentle enough for sensitive skin, but it's tough on the aches and pains you get from putting in a hard day's work in the garden. For me, I have issues with my right wrist and my right elbow specifically, which when you're doing a bunch of pruning or digging, you're using both of those joints a lot. So I like to rub it on both of those, and it helps out quite a bit. And thanks to Nature's Willow, the official pain cream partner of Epic Gardening, you're getting a 25% discount. You can use the link that's showing up in the chat right now, or go to natureswillow.com/discount/GGA25 to claim that discount. And now back to the video.
This year, one of the things that we've both learned a lot about is actually fertilizer use. Fertilizer is something that I think everyone has some experience in at some point in their life. When I first started growing, I was using synthetic stuff because I thought that's what you needed to do to grow big tomatoes. And after even just 6 months, I have switched to like organic-based fertilizers, but we've been running a lot of different fertilizer experiments. And one of the things that surprised me the most was actually how much you're supposed to be putting in. If you're growing, like let's say you go to the nursery, you get yourself a grow bag or a container, you get some soil, fill it up, plant your broccoli, you'll probably get some broccoli. But the thing that's missing from that soil, it even says it on the bag, is that it doesn't have complete nutrients for a full growth cycle. It might have enough to get you started, but if you want that truly massive yield, you're going to have to fertilize, and you're gonna have to follow the instructions on the bag. What I found was that I've been under fertilizing. I've been putting in like a sprinkle or like maybe a little dash here. I'm like,
too much, yeah.
Oh, a little bit too much. I read the instructions and it's like, you put in like 6 tablespoons when I was putting in 1. And it's made a really big difference. It's not necessary, of course, but if you are trying to maximize yield, you need to maximize the amount of nutrition that you're actually giving that plant.
This is the thing that I think, whether you're an organic gardener, container gardener, conventional, whatever, the plants don't care.
No.
They don't care what you are. Like they care what they can do with what you give them. And that's what you got to think about. What is a plant doing? It is taking inputs from the environment. It's taking, you know, sunlight, it's photosynthesizing, it's producing energy. It's of course taking water and nutrients from the ground, oxygen even in through the roots. And it is then transforming that into matter for you, right? It's the beauty of it. It's why I always say, you don't grow a plant, you give it an environment in which it grows itself. It's not, you're not in there moving the cells around, you know? And so this would be amazing. I mean, if that's, you'd never see me on camera again if I could just
be plugged in.
That, just, you know, like Avatar, putting it in the back of the head. But anyways, my whole point here is, I think there's sometimes a bit of a overemphasis on don't do anything to the plant, like no everything, no till, no fur, no this, no that. It's like, great, no harvest sometimes.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, if you're a container gardener, you're on a deck, you're on a balcony, you're on this, if you're putting a beefsteak tomato in a 10-gal bucket and you think it's going to produce like it's going to produce in ground with good irrigation, good compost, good mulch, you're in for a different story. You have to be fertilizing those plants for a couple reasons. Number one, it's going to use that nutrient in the soil up pretty quickly, that initial sort of base that's in that whatever bag mix you use. It's going to wash out over the course of the season because you're watering into a thing with drainage holes that's very small, and it's just not where it evolved to grow. It was connected to the earth when it was evolving and being developed, right? And so you really have to think, experiment with fertilizing.
Yes.
Just experiment with it this year and see, maybe do 1 grow bag with, 1 grow bag without, or 1 bed with, 1 bed without, and see the difference. We actually just did an experiment trying to beat some of the bagged soils that are out there that do really well, that grow really well. And we found some really interesting insights, and in both cases, you had a better mix than I did in this case. We both found that the amount of fertilizer we used was more than we thought, and it was the right amount.
Yeah, and the plants did great.
Yeah, did really good.
One of the other things we're actually trying, and we don't even know the results of this yet, is whether we could even take a really poor or cheap mix that doesn't have anything in it, add a little bit of fertility, and compare it to a really premium soil, and see if you could get the same results. Because a lot of it, like you said, like you're in a container, there's nowhere for those roots to go. If you plant in the earth, the plant will scavenge. It'll send out roots in every which direction as much as it can, and it will try to find what it needs. But you're giving it exactly what it has access to in that bag. If you're expecting it to grow for 6 months and thrive, it might have a little bit of a challenge. Now, one thing that we should touch on is that fertilizer isn't the only way to get a lot of yields. Now, one of the things that we've both done a little bit of, especially lately, is doing things like cover cropping and using compost. And even, I think both of us have now started a little bit more to rotate in the garden.
Yes.
And that's one of those things where as a backyard gardener, you're like, is it really
What am I, a farmer?
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, now I have to like plan out, like this is plot 1 this year, 2, and then you have to rotate. So what we found, at least what I found, is that for heavy yielders like tomatoes, it makes sense to rotate them because you have 1 root disease or 1 soil disease, it gets on your tomato, your yield is compromised. You cannot reach your full capacity. And that is one of the great reasons to even try containers. Just make sure you add a little bit of fertilizer. I'd say for containers, I would always recommend fertilizer.
Always.
In ground, it's a little bit easier to get away with it, but it all depends on what you already have to work with when you first started your garden.
I would say this is kind of my approach. let's say you're like me and you moved into a home or you have some space and it's just whatever soil. It's just whatever's there. In my case, it was basically neglected, weedy fill dirt from when the house was built, probably like 80, 100 years ago or something. And so what am I trying to preserve really? It's already been degraded, right? And so what I did is I did a first season till, very hard till, broke all that soil up. I tilled in compost, which I think that's sometimes a little controversial. In my case, I felt like it was the right decision. And everything I planted in that first season, I gave it a boost at planting time because I know the soil's not ready yet. Right now, in this garden, which has been 4 seasons, this soil's killer. It's good now. So I don't need to supplement with as much fertilizer, even organic granular. I don't have to. And I
get your baseline up to a certain point where you're not really relying on inputs anymore.
As much. And I think, you know, even then though, sometimes I will come through and I will say light nitrogen fertilizer. Or, for example, one of my bigger successes is, if we're talking maximum yield, is I had a 80 hand banana harvest, like 80 bananas on one big trunk that I just harvested recently. It took me a while to get there and I wasn't respecting the plant, what the plant needed. Once I upped the fertilizer on the bananas, including my own human urine, because spoiler alert, that actually is a good source of nitrogen. Bananas just love nitrogen. And they can't get enough of it. They can take, I believe it's like a half a pound to a pound over the course of a month or something like that.
Crazy.
It's pretty wild what they can do because they grow so fast and it's all leaves. Right? And so to me, I think you really have to understand the plant, your conditions, all that kind of stuff. There's no shame in doing something to boost it. But we do have to talk about things, basically like there's like boosting the plant and then there's preventing the downside. And extending.
Exactly. Like sometimes you're boosting the plant by giving it the nutrients it wants or needs at that moment. But there's other things that we do all the time, especially around the shoulder season. So right now we're into early spring. What is it outside? It could be a little bit cold, especially at night. It still gets quite cold and maybe even damp. And you want to get as much of that heat into your plant as possible. Well, if you want to boost your yields, then you might want to consider using covers in the garden. This could be like frost fabric, cloches, everything like that that provides a little bit of an extra insulated space for that plant can make a world of a difference. Like out there, we actually have potatoes growing. And one of the rows of potatoes we covered with the frost cloth, that was the first potato up. And it is now basically twice the size of the rest of them.
Twice the size.
So we know that it works. And that is something that you don't just throw away. You could use that fabric for years and years. You could maintain it. It's not like you're just adding something into the soil that disappears.
I actually think that is a sleeper tip that we've started to apply to things you wouldn't think of. Like, for example, the potatoes. We put the frost cover over the row of potatoes before they were up, like weeks before they were
on the ground.
And we gave it enough slack so that the potato bush, as it comes up, could actually fully live under it the whole time to maturity. And we learned this from our friend, Potato Ty, who runs a potato farm up in Canada. And he said, for them, it's really important for them to have the first potatoes of the year because they're one of the bigger providers of potatoes in Canada. Food security, all that kind of stuff.
First to market, you're always going to get the best price.
Best pricing. And so they'll throw floating rows over all their fields.
That's a lot of work.
Or depends on the variety. And he says, we'll be a month faster than everyone else to market. And that's the same yield, right? And so that's playing with timing and not necessarily performance, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was even potentially more potatoes, because what that does is it buffers the temperatures throughout the season, a little bit more stable, more optimal.
Yeah, and it helps like even diffuse light a little bit to some extent. But one of the other things that I've done that's free, basically, well, it didn't cost me anything for my peppers this last year was I was like, okay, I planted my peppers, it's spring, it's still a little bit cold. How do I get these to grow faster? I didn't even have cloth. All I did is I removed mulch from the surface of my soil. From the previous season, I had some leftover straw, and I just put fresh compost on top. That dark compost basically is black. When the sun hits it, heats up the soil way faster than having mulch on top. So there's times where mulch in the garden, while it does always help water retention, can actually even hinder you a little bit in those early seasons when you're trying to get mostly heat into your garden bed. The other thing I did to boost that even further was I just got burlap coffee sacks from my local coffee roaster for free. They just give them away. And I made a little windbreak around my peppers. So windbreak, block the cold winds, stop the cold winds from settling there at night, and fresh dark compost. My peppers were going like crazy.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, this is where to me, the fun of gardening really gets in. Once you kind of get the baseline skills, I know how to grow a tomato. I know how to get a pepper. Now it starts to become just how good of a pepper can I grow? Just how good of a tomato can I grow? To me, it gets really fun. Like you get to flex your thinking hat a little bit. And that's the thinking hat right there, actually. I don't have one. I'm a little dumber than he is. But anyways, it's such a clever optimization. It's almost doing nothing.
Yeah,
it's almost doing nothing at all.
Yeah.
And you modulate, and there's so many different ways. And I'll leave you with one is this one I got from my friend David the Good. He's been on the podcast for a while. But if you want to bump a zone, it's called pushing the zone. Dark wall, put a tree next to it, and that tree that couldn't grow all of a sudden can grow because you pump the zone by one, because it's going to let heat out over the course of the night, and it's also going to absorb more heat, artificially raising the temperature in that area with about 4 or 5 foot radius. And so many different ways to push the yield in your garden this year. I just make it a killer year, guys. I mean, thank you for watching this video. We've been having a lot of fun here on the Great Grow Along. And the world of epic gardening runs deep. It's deeper every year. The roots keep growing, you know? So we've got our YouTube channel. If you like Jacques' stuff, you can check out his channel, Jacques in the Garden. We have a seed company called Botanical Interests. It's at 5,000 plus nurseries around the country, but you can also buy them directly from us at botanicalinterests.com. And if you want to learn, we've got a blog at epicgardening.com and a store at shop.epicgardening.com where you can get all sorts of cool stuff, including botanical interest seeds, but also our raised beds, our patented seed starting trays, all some really cool stuff to help you boost that yield this year. So thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Good luck in the garden and keep on growing.
Well, that was a lot of fun, guys. Thank you for sharing. We have a lot of great questions we're going to answer, but first I want to thank our sponsors for this session. Nature's Willow, Element. Jacques can tell us a little bit more about them in a second, and you for being the title sponsor this year for Great Grow Along. My name's Luann DeJoy. I'm the founder of Great Grow Along. I'm your host today, and I'm excited to be here. I want to do a little shout out. Do we have any of our people from Philly? Because Jacques, Kevin, and I were just at the Philly Flower Show last weekend. We had a lot of epic fans there. We had a really good time. So if we have any of our Philly people there, hello to you. Anyway, before we get going, Jacques, do you want to tell us a little bit about Element?
I'm gonna let Kevin take it away, actually.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would say I have a jar of it right now, but it's going to be my second glass of the day. But Element is a electrolyte hydrating mix. It comes in a packet. They also have sparkling cans now, which are really tasty. And it's basically just a way to add hydration to your day. With spring, I'm out in the garden a lot. Jacques, I know you're out in the garden a lot, especially in the summer. I'm using Element. I've been using it for maybe 6-7 months now. It's got none of the weird ingredients that like other things have, you know, artificial sweeteners, artificial colors, that kind of stuff. Just delicious, hydrating electrolyte mix. I like citrus salt. There's raspberry salt. There's grapefruit salt. There's
Watermelon's my favorite.
Yeah, watermelons. Watermelon's a good one as well. Grapefruit's yours? Yeah. So you just mix it in. You have, you know, 1 pack a day, especially if you're doing some extra strenuous exercise and you're in a good spot. And I believe if you go to drinklmnt.com/epic, you do get a free sample pack with any order. So it's a good deal. We love them. We've been a sponsor of Epic for quite a while now, maybe 6 to 9 months or so. So thanks to Element for also sponsoring the Great Grow Along.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. Well, you know, we have some really great questions in the chat, so let's just get right to it. So Lisa is asking, and I love this question. She watched the previous 2 sessions, which is great. And she wants to know, beyond what you're excited to grow, which has been fabulous, she's curious if you're excited about any new products or techniques that you can share with the GGA audience.
Oh, new products or techniques. Well, there's a couple things we've come out with recently. I mean, this is our product, so a little biased, I guess, but it's our 16 cell tray. I've been using them a lot. So we had the Epic 6 cell trays for a while now, maybe like 4 years. The 16 cell will fit 8 in a 1020. So it's quite a bit of growing sites. And if you're a crazy sort of flower starter, or in my case, like peppers this year, I'm doing a lot of peppers. I like starting them in the 16s because I just get way more per tray. So I've been trying that out. Techniques wise, Jacques, you trying anything?
This year, techniques-wise, I know I have some stuff in mind, and I can never remember when somebody asked me. But I am doing a lot more dense planting, I think, this year. I'm going to be trying to focus on saving water a lot this year because it's been such a dry year. So you might see some different techniques as I try to approach ways of saving water in the garden. In terms of the product, I am also very excited about our seed starting trays, like the 3-inch pot too. And I'm also really excited because we have this new garden box, which is very quick, affordable bed that has all these accessories too. So it's really fun for beginner gardeners. But yeah, I am very much looking forward to saving water in the garden this year, especially with rising water costs.
Excellent. Well, thanks. All right. So Pat has a couple questions. First off, question about sweet potatoes. So sweet potatoes versus white potatoes. For the sweet potatoes, do you plant the slip at the bottom and continue to raise the soil level up, or do you plant the sweet potato at the top of the planter full of soil? Which works better?
I've only tried the latter. So I've only really planted sweet potato slips into a bed that's kind of at its normal height. I have seen people have success doing the former, where they kind of hill it up or planting on hills in the first place. But I've had some really great. I mean, actually, last year was probably my best sweet potato harvest, and that was just straight in a raised bed that was already filled.
Yeah, I agree. I think in general, one of the interesting things that I have tried that did work was actually in a grow bag, I planted the sweet potato slip, just as I would at the surface. And then as it grew, I actually put a cage around it and filled that with mulch. And the sweet potato grew through that and set additional tubers inside whatever that slip passed through. So you can get more that way. But in general, I think they will just swell from the roots that they grow. So even if you plant it deep or plant it near the surface, any of the roots that form underground can all potentially become a sweet potato. So I don't know if you necessarily get more because it is more work to produce those potatoes, but it could be a fun experiment to try.
Well, I'm a little obsessed with sweet potatoes, so I'm going to just derail and ask my own little question here. Have you ever grown some of the unusual heirloom varieties, like the white ones or the purple ones?
I have grown the
I
white and the purples, and I find them I personally like the taste more. And so I would just start those slips from the grocery store sweet potato that I bought. But I didn't notice anything different growing wise. I don't know about you, Kevin.
No, they grew pretty much the same for me.
Cool. All right. So Susan has a question about fertilizing. What do you use to fertilize veggies versus flowers?
To be honest, I don't grow enough flowers with that the approach to maybe have like a cut flower farm or something like that that I would fertilize them actively. I pretty much just plant flowers in as I normally would. Maybe I'd sprinkle a little all-purpose fert in there. With veggies, it can get a little more specific. I guess it just depends on the vegetable. Like early on, let's say in tomatoes, I might do a little bit higher on the nitrogen, and then I might move into sort of the PK style nutrients later on. But there's a lot of vegetables that I don't even fertilize at all. Like take growing potatoes. I don't do much there. I don't do much in the way of anything that's a leafy green because I sort of assume I've built my soil to a place where there's a good amount of nitrogen and organic in the soil. I don't know if Jacques, you do anything different.
Yeah, I will occasionally. I have like a couple dedicated flowers, like in pots, like roses or dahlias, and even the plumerias. And those, what I'll do is I will get a more flower specific fertilizer, which tends to be higher in the P and the K, which are more towards fruiting and flowering. So those are like NPK. The last two numbers on a fertilizer bag are really the ones that are more towards flowering. So I will occasionally use something like that, generally a liquid during the blooming season, like peak blooming season. And that can give you a little bit more blooms, but it's another little like micromanaging thing. And so a lot of times I just forget and don't do it because I just it's just something you have to remember. But in terms of differences, I find that in general, most fertilizer is useful across the board for any plant. It can get specific with things like blueberries, for example, that need acidic soil, or like citrus, which prefers actually a lot more nitrogen than like phosphorus and potassium in terms of fruit trees. But otherwise, like in general, anything that you add, as long as it's not too much nitrogen for something like a tomato when it's in the fruiting season, because that'll just encourage leaf growth, you're pretty much safe using an all-purpose blend around the garden.
Cool. That's a great segue into the next question from Pat. Aren't there plants that don't want rich fertilized soil? Like figs, do figs do poorly in soil that you make it too rich? And root vegetables possibly need different nutrients than a fruiting vegetable. So too much nitrogen gives you foliage, not roots, which you just said, Jacques. Do you have any thoughts
Hmm.
about that? About over fertilizing, perhaps? Veggies that are good on their own?
Hmm.
I mean, I mean, I guess one thing I would say generally is you can't, like, plants can't accept unlimited fertility, right? So
Yeah.
there's a certain amount that they will take, sort of their genetic potential, assuming all conditions are right. Giving them more than that doesn't really do anything. Um, there's a lot of plants that you pretty much don't have to do much with after, like, take like anything in the legume family. I tend to find that they don't really need that much, especially because they are nitrogen fixers. So they're taking some nitrogen out of the air and sort of using that to grow. There's things like, I think, over fertilizing root crops, like the questioner asked, can be a problem. Like, you can get crazy sort of hairy carrots if you do that. You can get very weird looking turnips or radishes. Like I mentioned, like, sometimes alliums, like any onion, garlic, leek, I would say early on maybe they might benefit from a little bit of nitrogen. So like a, I don't know, a feather meal or something like that. But later on, you could give them a little bit, but I've never found it to be like required. I've found
Yeah.
myself to do okay without it.
Yeah, I think like in general, when it comes to things that are like storage crops or root crops, like the onions, the alliums, the potatoes. The general rule of thumb that I follow is to fertilize them early in their life, but not at the end of their life. So once the garlic starts making the bulb, you don't want to actually juice it any further because it's just going to lead to a bulb that doesn't store as long. You want it to sort of not like be like maximized in its growth. You want it to slowly build that bulb up. It'll help it last longer. It'll probably have like a more pungent flavor. So things like that, like you don't want to encourage rapid growth near the end of the life of like an onion, because again, it's going to swell and not lead to as better of a storage situation. So that's kind of like the only thing I could really think of. Maybe like Mediterranean herbs, like I never fertilize things like thyme or anything like that. But yeah,
Okay, well, now it appears that we are entering the poop discussion portion of our day. We're
Let's
going to
do
start with
it.
the easy part, which is Connie is wondering if you ever use worm castings.
ah,
I
yeah,
use them. Well, I used to worm compost or vermicompost a lot more often than I do now. I just have a pretty robust hot composting system now, so I don't do worm composting as much. But yeah, we mix in worm casting. Jacques actually has a pretty clever recipe for taking any potting mix into a seedling mix. I'll let him share that.
yeah. I was gonna say like the main area where I tend to use worm castings is actually in my seed starting or potting up soil. Since worm castings, they're like not technically a fertilizer. I don't think that even literally or any way that they're a fertilizer. They have some small amount of fertility. I think usually like maybe 111, but not even like point five or something. So they're really nice because it's not going to like cause any root burn. It's not going to stress any seedlings out. And when I say something like root burn, it's because a young plant, if you give it too much fertility, it's actually hard for it to use it, which could actually damage the plant. So you could get burnt little edges. They're called burnt because they look like they've turned yellow and wilted back on like the leaf edges or even on the roots. So worm castings is great because it's usually an alive product that has like microbiome in there, like beneficial bacteria, nematodes, and things like that. And they have some amount of nutrition. So a young seedling can really make use of that. And I think it really helps your plants, especially at that pot up stage, grow really robustly and look really vigorous and healthy. So I tend to get like deeper green seedlings when I use something like worm castings to help ease out that nutritional gap before they go in the ground. So that's usually where I use it because especially it's like an expensive product for the amount you use. I find that in a seedling tray you get your best bang for the buck, basically.
Cool. All right. Well, then the next question is about using rabbit manure. Do either of you
Oh.
have you ever used rabbit manure? I've heard that it doesn't need to decay as long as chicken and other types, so it's a little less burny if you put it directly
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
garden.
Yeah, that is true. It's a cold manure, so you can put it on right away. But I just don't have a lot of access to it, to be honest with you. Weirdly, I have more access to alpaca manure because there's a couple alpaca farms around here. But that's also a great manure. But I would say if you do have access to rabbit manure, go ahead and mix it in. I don't see a problem with that.
Yeah, because the only thing I know about it is that you could use it right away. Like as soon as it's on the ground, you could apply it and it's going to be available nutrients for your plants. So that's pretty neat. But I have not actually used it.
Okay, well, the final poop question for today is from Judith. She says she has a lot of deer walking through her garden. Is their
Mm.
poop good for the plants?
Deer poop, I don't know that one. I'm sorry. I just don't have to deal with it. Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
lot. What's the deal with all these poop questions though?
I don't
Yeah.
know. I
The
don't
deer poop
know.
is interesting. I don't know. I would probably not use it straight up. I don't know enough again about deer poop to say anything for sure. But it
You know,
probably has some weed seeds, is my guess.
yes, that's a very good point. Well, let's talk about fish emulsion real quick. How do you like to
Mm.
use that? Someone was saying that they like to use that sort of mid-season with their garlic, and it really helps with the bulbs in response to what you were saying, Jacques. So, any
Oh
thoughts
yeah.
on fish emulsion?
Yeah, I think in that middle season, it's a great time because the thing with like something like garlic is that its first half of its lifespan is just trying to produce leaves. And then for the second half of its lifespan, now those leaves are basically like the solar panels that are charging up the bulb underground. So adding a little bit of like fertilizer such as a fish emulsion, which is another one of those things where it's liquid, it's broken down, so it's very rapidly available for the plant to use. That's a great option for like a mid-season fertility because it's not going to like linger and continuously feed the plant when later on you might not want that. It's like a nice little bonus feed in the middle of the season. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Any really organic based liquid for fertility is pretty solid. The fish stuff I haven't used as much. I think it's higher on the nitrogen side, but it's a great option if you could get it.
Awesome. All right. Well, we started a little fire talking about saving water, water saving gardening, Jacques. So
Mm.
Judith was, oh, let's see, Melanie was asking, since you're interested in conserving water, do you use any rainwater catchment systems or rain barrels?
I'll definitely let Kevin touch on his. I have not invested into the rain capture system yet, especially at the time. Like now, with the cost of water is supposed to go up a lot in San Diego over the next couple of years, it might make financial sense, but it does. The barrels themselves are quite expensive to start stacking up and building, and our rainfall only happens from like, if we're lucky, December basically until April. And I don't really need any extra water until I get all the way out to like August and September. So it's kind of like an annoying process here. But it's actually worked quite well at Kevin's, which has made me feel more interested in doing it. So I'll let Kevin talk about his.
Yeah, so what I started with was, well, I guess I kind of started at the end. So I put in a cistern, 5,000 gallon cistern, which, like Jacques mentioned, those are expensive. Even if you get one out of metal, you can go plastic or metal. Plastic obviously comes on a huge truck because it's just one piece. Metal's a little bit less expensive, I believe, because you can build them
Mm,
in pieces and they transport a lot easier. But either way, when you do the math on the cost of installing the rainwater capture and the materials relative to just city water, even at the new pricing that we would be getting, it's
yeah.
still more expensive. But it's about having it. It's not really about is it more expensive than city water. So I have 5,000 gallons of capture off of my roof, and then the areas of the roof that don't connect to that system, I also have put an additional barrel or smaller cistern. I find it really helpful. I've used like in the summer months, like we use the rainwater quite often. It waters the pond. Um, I really like it. I think if you want to get into it, start small, and you can usually get like city rebates. Depends on
Mhm.
your municipality, but you can usually get city rebates on like $50 off a cistern or a barrel, or even like a gray water conversion kit. Sometimes they'll give you a rebate on, which would be taking your laundry water and being able to divert it to the garden, which I also have installed. That's how my artichoke patch gets watered all the time now. So I love it.
Awesome. Okay, well, we have two last questions. The first is you had mentioned Norland potatoes. This is from Karen. Norland potatoes for grow bags. Are there others you've had success with?
Norland's the one I've had the most success with personally. And again, like I think I mentioned in the video, it is region dependent what'll work well for you. But in a grow bag, maybe a little bit less so. I'm doing Yukon Gold in them right now, and I'm doing Russet in them right now. Both of those seem to be fine. So some of the basic varieties are working for me.
Doc, do you have anything to add?
I would say that the other one that we've grown quite a bit this past couple of years, especially, is like Sarpomira. It's like a super specialty potato. It's not one that I'm like seeing that often. Like Wood Prairie Farm is one that carries it, but especially in raised beds and in our lined grow bags. So we have our own separate line of grow bags that have an extra liner in the top level of the grow bag, like the top 3/4, which helps retain water near the surface. Because the hardest thing that I've had with growing potatoes in grow bags is letting the soil dry out too much in between waterings. And so that little extra layer has actually improved my harvest in terms of growing in containers a lot more. Otherwise, I've struggled a lot with them drying out towards like those drier months of the year. But yeah, Sarpomira, great variety. And then using something that's a little bit more water retentive, like a line grow bag, I think helps a lot too.
Awesome. Okay, final question. What plants do you like to use for companion planting?
Mm.
Oh, that's a
Do you want me
very.
to take all the good ones, or do you want to go first?
You take the good ones, Jacques. Go ahead.
My favorite like standard ones that I've been growing, I'll just speak on tomatoes because that's the big one for me, is French marigolds, especially like the smaller ones. Like the Botanical Interest has one called Naughty Marietta, which doesn't get that tall and looks really cool. So it doesn't compete with my tomato. Alyssum is another one. It's in the Brassica family, I believe, or mustard family. It's a very short plant that has hundreds of little flowers. So it's very good at attracting hoverflies, those little wasps that could protect you from hornworms, bees, everything like that. And then I always like to mix in some herbs like basil or dill because they smell good. They're good with the tomatoes, so they're right next to each other. Those are kind of the ones that I do. And then oddly, I also will do lettuce as a companion plant because it's not a very aggressive plant. It doesn't take that much. So I could kind of squeeze it in to a lot of different places.
Yeah, I think those are all good. I think I've been experimenting with some interesting ones last year. Tried out like tomatoes with cucumbers underneath,
Mm,
which is kind of an interesting combo. Um, I just kind of like popping. I mean, so there's companion planting for like the benefits, like, oh,
right.
this plant does this for that plant. I also just kind of like combos that make my harvesting a little easier. So, whatever I want to eat with my tomatoes, maybe I'll just try planting that next to my tomatoes type thing. I also had a good time last year just throwing. We bought or started too many onion starts. So we just had way too many. And so what we ended up doing was I had an onion bed, but then I had like 50 to 100 more onion starts on top of that. And so I just found little gaps in, let's say, my pepper bed or my tomato area or whatever. And I just kept putting the onions all over the place. And that was kind of nice because I could walk around and just harvest one onion for dinner, one onion for dinner. And I wasn't like clearing out a whole area of the garden. And so it kept the garden looking nice. Something that I've struggled with in the past is like you clear a whole area, you plant it, you clear it, you plant it. You don't get that kind of nice, continually planted vibe. So that's worked well for me. I know those aren't the traditional companion planting suggestions, but just some of the things I've tried.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a good idea. Okay, well, we've come to the end of your third session with Great Grow Along, telling us what you're excited about this year. Thank you so much for sharing that today and the other 2 weekends. Thanks, Jacques, for doing the panel the first weekend. And thank you for being a sponsor.
Yeah.
Everybody that's watching, we're going to be back after the Inspiration Hour at 3 p.m. Eastern for favorites for the Cut Flower Garden with Jennifer Guluzia. Thanks, guys. Have a great rest of your weekend.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.